Lesson 92, Indirect Objects. Okay, so it's time to learn what another case does in German. And so to understand what that case is doing, we need to understand what an indirect object is. You already know what the direct object is. The direct object is the target of the action that's being performed. So what is an indirect object? Okay, the best and simplest way to explain it is that the indirect object is the party in the sentence that is receiving or benefiting. So just remember those two words, receiving or benefiting. And in different languages, you designate the indirect object in different ways. And actually in English, we have two different ways to do this, which I'll show you right now. In this lesson, I'm only going to show it to you in English so you can get the concept or the idea, and then we'll talk about it in German in a separate lesson. So after this lesson, I want you to just know what an indirect object is, okay? Okay, as I said a moment ago, the indirect object is the party that is receiving or benefiting, okay? So if you have a sentence about someone giving something to someone, the person that they're giving the thing to, that's the indirect object. If you have a sentence about someone showing something to someone, the party that you're showing the thing to, that's the indirect object. If you're buying something for someone, the party you're buying something for, that's the indirect object. Okay, so giving, buying, showing, all those things, the person that you're buying something for, showing something to, that's the indirect object because they're the recipient of the action. They're the recipient or the beneficiary of what is happening. So we have a few example sentences here. He gave the book to Johnny. So the subject is he, the verb is gave, and the word book here is the direct object. That's the target of the action. Someone's giving the book, right? But to whom are they giving the book? They're giving it to Johnny. So Johnny is the party that is receiving or benefiting. Next, she told a story to the class. Okay, the subject is she, the verb is told, and the direct object is story. But who's getting the story? Who is the story being told to? Well, the class. And so in this sentence, the word class is the indirect object. The class is the party that is benefiting or receiving. In the next sentence, we have someone buying gifts for someone. Okay, the word friends here is the indirect object. They're the ones benefiting or receiving. And finally, we have someone showing something, showing a rock collection. Mr. Green is the indirect object because he's the party that the rock collection is being shown to. He's the beneficiary or recipient, the one benefiting or receiving. Now, notice in all these four examples, we needed a preposition to help us designate who the indirect object is. In each of these, we use the word to or the word for. To Johnny, to the class, for her friends, to Mr. Green, okay? So in English, we need a little bit of help, oftentimes, from an extra word like to or for to help indicate who the indirect object is, okay? But in English, we have yet another way to designate the indirect object. And what we're going to do here is we're going to switcheroo the order of the words. Okay, we're going to take the indirect object that before was at the end of the sentence. Notice in those examples we looked at, the indirect object is at the end of the sentence. Now we're going to take that and park it before the direct object. So these sentences are going to say the exact same thing as before, but with a different word order. Okay, let's take a look. Number one says, he gave Johnny the book. Okay, if we just stop with the word Johnny and said, he gave Johnny, we would wonder what's going on. Is someone giving Johnny away? But in the sentence as a whole, it would say, he gave Johnny the book. And when we hear that last part, suddenly it makes sense. We know that the book is the direct object, and the word Johnny is the recipient of the book. Now notice when the word Johnny came at the end of the sentence, we needed a helper word. We needed to say to Johnny. But in this word order, we don't need the word to. We can just say he gave Johnny the book. And with that word order, we don't need that preposition to anymore. Okay, so this is what happens when you take the indirect object and you park it before the direct object. Let's try it again. She told the class a story. Okay, so she is the subject, told is the verb, and story is the direct object. So she told a story, but when we park the word class there before the direct object, it becomes clear that that's the recipient of the story, the ones hearing it, okay? When we had the word class at the end of the sentence, we had to say to the class. But here in this word order, we don't need to do that. Just by changing the word order and putting this indirect object before the direct object, it becomes clear that that is the indirect object, and we don't need any kind of helper word. We don't need any kind of preposition like to or for. Again, she bought her friends some gifts. If you just stopped with the word friends and said she bought her friends, it wouldn't make any sense. You'd think, wait, you can't buy friends. But when you hear the entire sentence, she bought her friends some gifts, it becomes clear that the word gifts is the direct object and friends is the indirect object. Same thing for the last one. He showed Mr. Green his rock collection. The collection is the direct object and Mr. Green is the indirect object. So the idea here is that in English, we have two different ways to designate the indirect object. We can do it with helper words like to or for, or we can do it with word order by parking the indirect object before the direct object. And finally, we ask you not to confuse indirect objects with other uses of prepositions such as to or for. If you say, I sailed to the island, that's just you're showing what direction or what place you were going to. It's not really an indirect object. So we have some exercises that we've created here to help you think through indirect objects. So for each exercise, try to locate the direct object and the indirect object, turn the recording off and try the exercises. And when you're done, turn the recording back on and we'll go through them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've done the exercises. Let's take a look at number 1. I loaned the money to my friend. Okay, the subject here is I, the verb is loaned, and the direct object here is the word money. Okay, so far so good. But then we have this friend here who is the beneficiary or recipient, the one benefiting or receiving. That means that the friend here is the indirect object. Notice that it's coming at the end of the sentence, so we have to use the word to designate who the indirect object is. We have a similar structure in number 2. The subject is we, the verb is donated, the direct object is money. The party that's receiving or benefiting is the charity. So that's the indirect object. It's coming at the end of the sentence, and we have to have the word to here to designate it. Number 3, he showed the class an example. Now here we have that flipped word order with the indirect object coming before the direct object. So this is a bit trickier. He is the subject, showed is the verb, and example is the direct object. Okay, but the class is the party that's benefiting or receiving. They're the ones that the example is being shown to, okay? So the word class here is the indirect object. Number 4, the subject here is the word us, as in let us, and then get is the verb. Curtains is the direct object. The party that is benefiting or receiving, that's the house. The curtains are being purchased for the house. So the word house is the indirect object. It's coming at the end of the sentence, so we need a word like to or for to show it. And in this particular sentence, we have the word for. Number 5 is almost exactly like it. You have someone buying something or getting something. The indirect object is at the end of the sentence. That's the garden, and we have the word for designating it. In number 6, we have the indirect object before the direct object. They made us some sandwiches. Okay, so they is the subject, made is the verb, sandwiches is the direct object. The party that's benefiting or receiving is us. So the word us here is the indirect object. And because of the word order, we don't need a word like to or for to indicate the indirect object. We know that us is the indirect object because it comes before the direct object. Same thing in number 7. The word judge is the indirect object. The story is the direct object. Okay, and since the indirect object is first, we don't need a word like to or for. In number 8, band is the subject, played is the verb, song is the direct object, and then we have the indirect object at the end of the sentence indicated by the word for, and that's the audience. A similar structure in number 9, I is the subject, brought is the verb, copies is the direct object, and everyone is the indirect object. It's designated by the word for, and it comes at the end. In number 10, we have the other word order where the indirect object comes before the direct object. So the word me is the indirect object, shirt is the direct object. Because of this word order, we don't need me to have any kind of helper word like to or for. We don't have to say for me or to me. It's clear from the word order.